Good day, everyone. My name is Josephine Cox, and I am a master's candidate for the International Adult English Language Education track at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, the USA. And I also work as an English language instructor at Institute UNIC, which is a distance university based out of Moscow, Russia. Today, I will be exploring the role of culture in lingua franca Englishes. We normally hear ELF, English as a lingua franca, or English as an international language, but why I chose this particular terminology I'll get to later on in my talk. Also, we'll be looking at accent perception of non-native English speakers in regards to linguistic capital. This particular topic has interested me since teaching and living abroad in Russia, Chile, New Zealand, and Australia, and seeing that English courses and textbooks target British and US culture and pronunciation, despite the majority of my students' needs for English as an international language. The role of pronunciation and cultural studies within the context of teaching and learning the English language has come into question in the past couple of decades as globalization and the historic influences of English colonization have expanded the role of English to be an international language, or today's most prominent lingua franca. Lingua francas are used for international communication. So when you're learning a language as a foreign language, you're learning that language to interact with and speak with the people of that language, the native speakers. But when you are wanting to communicate with another person who does not speak your language and is not necessarily a native speaker of the language you're learning, you need a tool of communication, a lingua franca. Gradle, back in 2006, estimated that 80% of English interactions are between two non-native speakers. So the needs of English language learners have evolved from native correctness of grammar and pronunciation, which is advocated in English as a foreign language courses, to effective international and intercultural communication. Jennifer Jenkins, who is a prominent linguist, researcher, and advocate of English as a lingua franca, or ELF, states that ELF is an artificial language because it is spoken between non-native speakers of the language. And cultural studies and culture is irrelevant in the learning of ELF because it is a caretaker speech. So my question is, where does intercultural competence come into play in English as a lingua franca studies? It has been suggested that the new English as a lingua franca course then contain linguistic aspects of language, grammar, vocabulary, pronunciation, for a variety of Englishes. And this is for effective intercultural communication and diversity. This content goes beyond translating. So one word concept does not necessarily translate to another language. So by developing this intercultural communication and intercultural competence, people then will be able to translate not word for word, grammar structure for grammar structure, but instead concept to concept. The issue remains how exactly to address this. Native speaker standards still hold high linguistic capital. This is partially because of traditional foreign language education, and the concept of teaching English as a lingua franca is relatively new in second language acquisition approaches. Also, international exams are measured by native speaker standards, even if those who are taking the exam will never interact with a native speaker of English. Of course, there are many other reasons, but what matters is that non-native speaker accents are considered to be inferior, as confirmed by Jennifer Jenkins's research. This issue transcends passing exams because accent and dialect perception can reveal biases of cultural perception. For example, several of my students have indicated they desire a native speaker accent because of unjust connotations that their mother tongue accent has. Also, non native speakers can be perceived as inept just because of a heavy accent. In a study done with Turkish postgraduate students, this concern was voiced. And this is a real concern, be it for academia or for daily life. Since English as a lingua franca is considered an artificial language, though, Dr. John O'Regan proposed a new term be applied to encompass a living language of diversity and acknowledge linguocultural identity. Lingua franca Englishes. Since the variety of Englishes used under the umbrella of a lingua franca are embedded with their own cultures and subcultures, there is a need for intercultural competence to approach the conflicting cultural differences between people. Cultural teaching and cultural comparisons are a basis for this. As two cultures meet using English as a lingua franca, ELF then develops its own culture. Kromsch calls this the third culture. For this third culture to be effective, it has to be, as Dewey says, fluid, flexible, contingent, hybrid, and deeply intercultural. So how do we get to this third culture? By exploring other cultures in relation to our own. Because of the rich diversity of English, and as it is also used as a tool of communication, acquiring ELF requires developing accommodation strategies. Kromsch states that ELF teaching now has a greater role to metalinguistic awareness and metapragmatic reflexivity. In my own words, this means the inclusivity of global diversity in pragmatics and dialects is part of understanding and learning English for international purposes. Why? Because surfing diversity does not equal engaging with difference. Accent tends to be united to cultural perceptions, which can trigger biases. Once English language learners are aware that accent does not equal intelligibility, the lingua franca classroom can then focus on attaining clear pronunciation and strategies to adapt to different accents. But as I mentioned earlier, the issue of linguistic capital is a barrier to this accent acceptance. Jenkins has collected a list of pronunciation features referred to as the lingua franca core. According to Jenkins, there are a few pronunciation features most salient to intelligibility, such as aspiration, vowel lengthening, consonant clusters, nuclear stress, and all consonants except the TH sounds. She proposes that non-native speaker pronunciation not be compared to native speaker, and their so-called native speaker errors do not necessarily detract from intelligibility. She says that learners should be made aware of the sociolinguistic factors relating to the spread of English, and by doing so enables learners to make informed choices about which English to develop. Jenkins is not advocating a ban on native speaker pronunciation, but rather presenting a platform of choices. Even so, Jenkins indicates that the lingua franca core is only a guide and not a rule of ELF pronunciation. What is needed, she says, in pronunciation teaching are accommodation skills. When communication breakdown occurs because of pronunciation, what can we pull on to piece together that communication again? This seems to be in line with the need of international competence and cultural communication in ELF. So, my question is that after all the research that concludes non-native speakers' English accents are perceived inferior, though English is used for international purposes, do prospective non-native teachers of English reflect this belief, or do they encourage the ELF approach? Also, does online communication between non-native speakers encourage accent identity? I'll be presenting research conducted by postgraduates in 2014 of English language learners in Malaysia, Norway, Taiwan, Indonesia, Japan, and most recently with my own students who are predominantly Russian. Kaur at the University of Ultra Malaysia in 2014 surveyed 35 Malaysian English language teacher trainees for young learners who had already been exposed to English as a lingua franca and English as an international language concepts. They followed the trend of Jenkins's research that native speaker accents are better than non-native speaker accents. They went on to describe their perceptions of British RP, Standard US, and other international English accents such as Japanese, Indian, and Spanish, amongst many others. As you can see, the British RP and Standard US are similar in that the participants said they're standard, clear, and understandable, but RP is also melodious, beautiful, quite okay, and US is simple, normal, and cool. But you can also see that a number of the participants had unfavorable descriptions of RP and US. It's like something in their mouth for RP or harsh and colloquial for US. Other accents had also favorable and unfavorable perceptions. The Japanese accent was described as unique, polite, and sometimes acceptable, to hard to understand and like a snail, and maybe not correct. Indian English was fluent, easy to understand, and melodious, to I have no idea, it's confusing. Again, there's this discrepancy of being understandable and not understandable. Spanish English was the same, fast and precise, romantic to barely intelligible. So it really depended on the individual and how they perceived each of the accents. Even though all accents were described both favorably and unfavorably, Kaur indicates that native speaker accents were described more positively than the non-native speaker accents, and that the participants perceived non-native speaker accents as deficient. One possible reason Kaur gives is that textbooks and materials used in Malaysia are native speaker centric. But interestingly enough, many of the participants noted that they perceived many of the non-native speaker accents as more intelligible than native speaker accents. One particular comment that I found interesting in Kaur's report was from respondent 31. In my opinion, we cannot look down on the non-native English accent as it symbolizes the identity of the speaker. They can just use their non-native English accent as long as the English they use is intelligible. Their English accent is their identity, so they do not have to change it into native speaker accent, like American. But yet, the participants still believed that non-native speaker accents are inferior to native speaker accents, the superior one. Reason at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology in 2014 found very similar perceptions with Norwegian prospective English language teachers. They believe that second language speakers do not need a perfect accent in English to communicate, but they still preferred British or American accents and considered that a Norwegian-influenced English accent as imperfect and associated it with learners of low-level proficiency. Jenkins and Gradle both indicate in their advocacy of English as a lingua franca that English does not belong to the native speakers anymore. But Reisen in this study in Norway indicates that it is still perceived as the language of others. It is a language that belongs to this idealized native speaker. But the participants in this study also demonstrated a careful shift in attitudes as teachers of tomorrow. So they believe that there needs to be an understanding and communication in the classroom of different accents and of different Englishes, but encourage a standard English. My students, though, have a slightly different profile than the Norwegian and Malaysian studies. They not only want to be educators, but they are also looking into the fields of translation, editing, management, international business, and IT. But they are all part of the Faculty of Linguistics at Institute UNIC, which is a distance university based out of Moscow, Russia. Their L1 is Russian, and most of them are Russian. The majority of my students are female, but I do have a handful of males, ages 20s through 50s, but most of them are younger in their 20s and early 30s. So the purpose of my survey was to determine if the perceptions of native speaker standards most commonly found in Jenkins's research reflect the opinions of candidates in the field of linguistics in light of intercultural communication and English as a lingua franca. Just over 70% of my students will be interacting with native speakers and non-native speakers, but 7.78% do not anticipate interacting with anybody, that they need English just for reading, writing, and listening purposes. As you can see, the trend still continues. 78.13% believe it is important to learn and copy native speaker pronunciation, where a mere just 20% think it's important to speak clearly and maintain their own accent. And 60% believe British pronunciation, British RP pronunciation, to be the best native speaker pronunciation to learn, even though less than 2% of the UK speak with RP accent, and just a little more of that, about 3% of the world speaks with RP accent. As I have been working with my students for 5 semesters, I had anticipated their preference for the British accent, even though I'm from the United States, and native speaker pronunciation. So my next question was, what accents do they believe are important in listening activities? As you can see, 73.26% said that a variety of standard English accents are important to listen to in their listening activities. Now, considering their goals in international language communication, I believed, or I perceived, that more of my students would find important to also listen to non-native speaking accents to be prepared for communication breakdowns. As you can see, only 11.63% indicated that non-native speaker accents were important in in-class listening activities. Regarding culture in the language classroom, Jenkins's research trends continue, with 60% of my ELLs indicating native speaker culture being the most important to study, with world cultures being at 22.47%. Again, this was very surprising to me considering their international goals. The next question I had was, what cultural activities would be best to learn about other cultures if they could not travel? 85% said reading books and magazines would be the best. 55% said watching movies and documentaries. About 32% said writing to other non-native speakers for online communication would help. Joining international social media groups, doing communication activities in their English language course, and participating in MOOCs. Only 16% agreed that meeting and getting involved with immigrants in their community would be a beneficial way of learning about other cultures. My last 2 questions was to see what my students' perception of a conversation course was. So, what are the most important features that they believe are in a conversation course? Well, this is all kind of divided. The other category, 15.15%, all the respondents said that all 3, grammar, fluency, and pronunciation, were important. For online writing, I wanted to know if online writing in forums, particularly, which is writing with speech likeness, would improve their conversation skills, despite that online writing has no pronunciation. 80% said yes, online writing helps improve their pronunciation skills. My next question was, have other researchers found the same, and is there any proof that online writing actually does improve conversation skills? Kay and Kahani in Taiwan actually did a study with 58 Taiwanese and 48 Indonesian ELLs, and they discovered that yes, online writing does help improve conversation skills. The rationale was that there was unequal power relationships reproduced through English, especially between native and non-native speakers, and their language students needed help with increasing confidence. Once the online communication commenced, the researchers reported saying that the Taiwanese and Indonesian participants realized that it's okay to have a local accent. And they noticed that there were a number of features in their English production that were influenced by their mother tongue. And they also figured out how to accommodate for these communication differences. Finally, they had an increased awareness to understand cultural differences. Going back to the Malaysians' perspective of accent and identity, the researchers found that the Taiwanese believed that a native speaker accent was a linguistic benchmark, and they did not associate their identity with English. In fact, they enjoyed having a native speaker accent or trying to attain a native speaker accent because it was a display of politeness, and they got to put on a different identity. The researchers also suggested that there be a compromise between EFL and ELF paradigm of teaching, that there needs to be a native speaker language norm, but they also need to build non-native speaker confidence through communication strategies. Prior to the Taiwanese and Indonesian study, Miyazo and Anderson in 2009 wanted to determine the effectiveness of online writing activities in formal education for ELLs in Japan. The study was similar to ones done in a number of other countries by a number of other researchers from all around the world. Um, and they actually did not aim for improving conversation skills, but just do online writing activities help ELLs in all their skills. But what they found out was that online writings and forums, blogs, and wikis, because of its speech likeness, improved speaking abilities. What is my conclusion after looking at all these studies and with my own students is that it is imminent that the approach of acquiring English for non-native speakers evolved to include intercultural competence. World culture and dialectal awareness in the English language classroom is a necessary fight against the perceptions of inadequacy of non-native English speakers and the inferiority of their non-standard accents. How this will be approached is to the discretion of the teacher or institute. And as McKay says, think globally, teach locally.